I'm Ava Rispini, and on behalf of the Department of Photography, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Forum on Contemporary Photography. This is the first forum of 3 that we'll be hosting this year, so we hope we'll see you in February and also in May. And I'm really delighted to introduce our 3 guest speakers for this evening. Peter Ely, who is a curator at MoMA PS1, who will lead a discussion with 2 artists, Sarah Charlesworth and John Pilson. Peter Ely is the curator of the September 11th exhibition, which is currently on view at MoMA PS1, and I hope you've all had a chance to see the show. It's thought-provoking and provocative. It's not an exhibition about photography per se. However, when I saw the exhibition, it made me reflect on the nature of images today. And one of the things that I left thinking about was how historical events have shaped the way that we think about pictures, and also conversely, how pictures have shaped the way that we remember historical events. I think the events of September 11th and all of the events of the last 10 years, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Arab Spring and even more recently the death of Gaddafi, have pointed to some very urgent issues in photography. For me, there's a kind of crisis of representation, if you will. And I think the rise of the amateur and the dissemination of images via social media and other digital forms have in certain ways questioned the role of the artist, the role of the photojournalist, the role of the professional photographer, among many other issues. These are just some things that I thought of when seeing the show. I'm sure Peter and Sarah and John will discuss other issues and ask questions to the group. Like all of our forums, this is, we hope that you will all participate actively in the discussion. We encourage you to ask questions, make comments, and not just be a passive audience. There are mics all over the rooms, and we encourage you to join in the conversation and to participate. Peter?
I'm gonna arm myself now. These work?
Feels like a rodeo. Well, thank you for having me. It's like a talk show. And to John and to Sarah for joining me tonight. I guess that I don't come from a photographic background. But photography was something that factored a lot into my thinking about how to do an exhibition about September 11th, in part because I was interested in some things connected to September 11th specifically, and also to the intervening 10 years, which I am delighted to have the occasion to pose to a group of people much more invested in that history and tradition than I am. One of which is about a question I have about how the nature of the attacks themselves, and the fact that that photography became a medium for the extension of the violence by setting up a certain kind of, the spectacularity of the events themselves then played into our desire to picture them. Making them essentially the most pictured events and in turn witnessed events in world history, I guess. I don't know actually where this statistic comes from, but the statistic that I saw repeated a lot was that 2 billion people watched some image of the attacks or the collapse or the aftermath, which in 2001 was a third of the world's population. And that's a remarkable statistic, I think, and the fact that images, whether they're filmic or photographic, I guess I'm sort of eliding the difference a little bit here. I'm interested in how that extension and, in a sense, corruption of the journalistic image, in a certain sense, or what I see as a corruption of that image, long corrupted in different ways before 9/11 and since. May have been changed, and how it's been changed specifically by that use. So I'm interested in that if people want to talk about that in a little bit. And I guess I'm also interested in how a certain way in which the wars on terror enacted in response to 9/11, which had been waged on a variety of conflicting terms of visibility, right? The sort of the refusal to allow pictures of returning coffins of dead American soldiers to be photographed and disseminated by the media, on one hand, concealing a certain kind of thing. And then on the other hand, the sort of if you see something, say something, invitation to imagine some kind of nefarious interior to things that aren't actually visible to us or are only visible on their surfaces. And then, of course, the ubiquitous racial profiling that 9/11 set in motion. That, I think, somehow feels like photography is the tip of that spear, somehow. And so I'm sort of curious about how those broader shifting conditions of visibility in the culture at large may be reflected in our relationship to the photographic image, both as makers and consumers. But Sarah and John both participated in the show, ultimately in different ways, with work made before 9/11. And indeed, I think Ava's question about how photographs change history, which I think with the upstart revolution in Iran last year and the murder of Neda, that one particular woman who I didn't see photographically, only sort of in a video form online, seemed to actually be a turning point in that conflict of sorts. That increasingly we seem to be able to seize upon, as we once were more able to, photographic images, or now YouTube videos, like of Gaddafi's head being jerked up and down, as somehow turning points. I wonder if they're turning points. But I guess I was interested in how also then history changes images. Which was why a lot of the show, 2/3 of the show that I organized, was stuff that predated the attacks. And at the beginning of our conversation, I think Sarah had some grave reservations about having this particular body of work from more than 20 years earlier.
30.
Well, at the time, 20 years earlier, right? 1980.
Right, it's 30 from now.
Well, but 20 years from the attacks.
Us?
Being read within this context, or being placed within this context. And so that we had a lot of interesting conversations about whether that was an appropriate thing or something. I was very interested in, for myself as a curator, what that meant to, or what kind of responsibility I have to images in my role. And photographs in some ways were the easiest way to, or the most immediate way to think about them. Sarah's in particular, but I think maybe Sarah and John want to say a few things. I know Sarah has also some images to show us tonight, so I think maybe we'll start with Sarah, and some of these things that I was raising can hopefully be filed in the back of people's minds, and we can return to them later.
For once, I get my own mic instead of having to grab the one that gets passed around. It's true that when Peter and I first started speaking about the inclusion of, can we have slide number 1? The inclusion of my piece, Unidentified Woman, Hotel Corona in Madrid, 1980, I had reservations. It really should be a whiter wall. I don't like that white frame around it. It has a black frame, and instead it looks like it's got a white frame. At any rate, I had some pause when Peter first invited me to be in the show, because I thought, well, that's not what the work is about. It's not about September 11th. And as a matter of fact, when these works from this series have been shown since September 11th, their meaning has shifted. They were originally, for me, about the limits of the photographic image. The one thing we want to know when we see a dramatic photo like this is, did the person live or did they die? Or, what were they trying to save themselves? Or are they trying to commit suicide? But for that instant, they're in suspense, and it's that instant that we all experience every moment of our lives. So that I was really interested in the media, the issue about the media, what is it like to live in a world of images that are very violent and you experience them indirectly on a piece of paper or through the television. So I paused and I said, I don't know if I want to be in this show or not. And then Peter and I discussed it, and I thought, self-censoring is ridiculous. That, of course, all art is changed by a changing historical perspective. People were very sensitive to these images, like in the Pictures Generation show at the Met. I've had a lot of kind of nervous feedback about these images since September 11th, because they seem to be exploitative or sensationalist or something, and they weren't supposed to be at all. They were supposed to be sort of philosophical. And so what happened when I thought about it, I said, okay, you can have it in the show. And then when I actually saw the show, I understood something that I was just beginning to understand, and I thought I understood all along for 20 years, but the show really brought it home for me, which is that a changing historical perspective changes our relationship to art. And, whether it's photographic art or any kind of art, Peter's show really brought that point home, that history frames photographs, artworks, and artworks, photographs frame history. So, that's how we think about things. We think about things through iconic images, and we access our perspective on time through images and artworks. So I started thinking about that, and I was also thinking in the back of my mind, I'm trying to resolve this question about sort of parafiction, and is there such a thing as a truth in an image, or truth in action? And I was thinking about works like Walid Rad and Yes Men, and people who make deliberately mendacious interventions in order to confuse our sense of reality. And then I happened to be, I was invited to a book pick for Art Forum, and I read I picked the Errol Morris book, Believing is Seeing, which is a really interesting book, by the way. And one of the things let's go on to the next photo for instance. I mean, this isn't from the Errol Morris book, but I was thinking about how, and I've always believed this, that photographs actually move social history. So a photograph like this of this woman, Fook, whatever her name was, with Americans napalm bombed outside of Saigon, and this little 10-year-old girl is running down the street, and these kids are crying, and it really gave energy to the anti-war movement in America, and that image will never go away. And anyway, that was 1972. Let's go on to the next image. I can barely remember. So we believe that image is true, and we know from art history that this image by Joe Rosenthal of the American soldiers raising the flag on Iwo Jima, we know this is sort of true. They were really doing that. We really took the mountain, but the photographer didn't quite get the right perspective on it when they were really putting the flagpole in, so they reenacted it for the camera. And so this is sort of true and sort of not true. Let's go on to the next one. Now this one actually I did get from the Errol Morris book, and I found this one totally fascinating because from the look of the image, we can't tell whether or not where are we? Who bombed who? It's a residential area, we can see that, but we can't tell, whether it's a Hezbollah bomb in a Jewish neighborhood or a Jewish bomb in a Palestinian neighborhood or a West Bank neighborhood. So the photographer, Ben Curtis, knows where he was. This photograph was taken in Lebanon, and it had no caption when it appeared in the New York Times except that it said it was taken in whatever city in Lebanon it was. And Errol Morris does an extensive interview with Ben Curtis and draws Ben Curtis out, and he said, did you place the Mickey Mouse there? And Ben Curtis said, no, I would never do that. It's completely against my ethics. But there's about 50 photographs of stuffed animals that are in these, Middle East war photos. So then Errol Morris keeps drawing him out and saying, well, what do you think it is? He said, well, I actually think that it was a Hezbollah bomb, but we don't really know that, and I would never say that because I don't know that. He said, the Hezbollah people don't really sort of come right out and talk to American journalists, so here we go. So he just sends the photo in. He said, this photo's in Lebanon. And so we know that Ben Curtis has professional ethics that are really keeping him, being as honest and as truthful as he can. But this photograph, published in an Israeli newspaper, blamed Hezbollah. This photograph appeared in another newspaper in Canada, and Errol Morris found it and blamed the Israelis. So the same image can actually be put to two different purposes. And we know that. We know that's true. We know that's how propaganda works. Let's go to the next photo. This is from, obviously a civil rights photograph. And this is very different than in this period in 1963. Here's, policemen and dogs attacking a marching civil rights protester. And this man, who was chewed up by the dogs, went underground after the photo was taken because he was so threatened that, somebody'd come after his family if they knew who he was, and if he, got any policeman in trouble, the white guys could come after him. So let's go to the next photo. There she is, Nedja. I don't really need to talk about this. I just wanted to stick it in there. And we all know about the image, and it becomes iconic. It symbolizes a social movement. It rallies people, and it affects people's emotions. You all know that. Yep. So it's not even a single image. Okay, so here's one that I snuck in over the weekend into my slide talk. It hadn't been there on Friday when I sent my slides to Roxana. And one of the things that really struck me about this image of Gaddafi dead, it's Gaddafi's son dead, is, sorry, it shows you what I know. I'm like, he looks awful young in that picture. It reminded me of another photo from the Abu Ghraib period when there was a series of photos actually of people with dead prisoners smiling, giving the thumbs up. Hey, here I am, as though they're in front of the Eiffel Tower and they're taking a picture of somebody on their honeymoon. It's a souvenir photo. I was here. I'm part of this picture. I'm part of this event, and I'm documenting myself and what's going on. So you see cameras aimed at Gaddafi's son, you see cameras aimed at at self. Let's go to the next one, which I can't remember. Phew! That's my daughter, Lucy. And this is an amateur photo that I took when I was talking to her on Skype. She did a senior semester abroad in London last fall, and we started having Skype conversations, and she'd show me around her dorm room and introduce me to her roommate. And this day she came out having just washed her hair, and she looked to me like like some kind of turbaned woman. And so I took a picture of my computer with my daughter, Lucy. Now I have to pause for a minute. I have 2 more photos to show you, and they're really super duper works in progress. And the reason I brought them is because I personally really believe that there isn't really such a thing as absolute truth, and that we are always viewing the world from our perspective. And photography shows us that, and art shows us that, and anthropology shows us that, and we all know that on some level. And I think it's the fallacy of Western science that always says, oh, science knows better, there really is an objective truth. But, you know, who knows? So I want to pause, and the question I want to ask is there a place for photography or art? Is there a place where there is an ultimate truth, or you can stand outside a frame and look at something and it's real? I don't think so. I don't think there's a big difference between straight photography and staged photography. I think it's a slippery slope in between them. And yet I'm totally committed and have been almost my entire life to art and to the possibility of it exploring and opening up ideas about how we see and understand the world. So I don't relate to this word photography very much. I just, you know, do whatever it is I do. Teach photography, take pictures, you know, make things in my studio. Okay. So I think there is a place for art, and I think photography can participate in it, photography can be it, photography can extend it, photography can document it, it can talk to it, it can be a photo of an installation. We don't, you know, there's no fixed point anywhere here. Okay, so I'm going to really expose myself with the last two slides and show you work that hasn't even been color corrected. These are works in process. My assistant back there is giggling because he's the one who's going to be like color correcting them. This is an image from my show that it will be in New York in March. It's a straight photograph. It hasn't been photoshopped. Nothing's happened to it yet. It just is what it is. And is it true? Is it false? Is this a Sarah work? Yes, this is a Sarah work. This looks like my work. And then I also have another image from this series, which is my studio wall. As I'm making the photographs, this is real. This is a real photograph. The other one's unreal. Or this is unreal and the other's real. What's the difference? It's, you know, it's trying to understand what photography is, what work is, what art is. And that's the end. That's all I have to say.
You should hold on to that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, John, if you had some questions or thoughts you wanted to pose at the outset.
Well, I guess it's real quickly. I'll just respond to the ones that you kind of. Well, I guess it seems like one question is, how did I feel about your show? It seemed like that was. I think I'm going to follow. I'm going to follow Sarah's lead. And yeah, and like Sarah, I had a lot of questions. But in the end, what I was impressed by was that it seemed that you were engaged in a very personal response to, a global subject of global impact, and that your putting the show together veered between things that felt purely intuitive and things that felt, fluently political at the same time. And in the end, I was very happy to be a part of it, just for the reason that it felt like a risk, and that, I think that curation, if there's a crisis, is probably there. In the sense that I find a lot of times it feels that I'm looking at things that are more about, in a way, like curatorial work has become more like journalism, in the sense that I feel like I'm being presented with what's going on rather than what's important. Of course, I thought it was like a little bit more important because you put me in it, but.
Although I wasn't at all, I mean, I hope you'll take this the right way. Yeah. I wasn't at all trying to say that your work was important.
Right.
I mean, that wasn't why it was there, I guess. It's not that I think it's unimportant, but it wasn't a show where I was trying to say this is important art that was made about this thing. Necessarily. It was
what I thought was important was that you did something that could easily have failed miserably. It could have been glib and illustrational, and it could have, been deeply superficial. And yet, from what I've heard,
Deeply superficial.
was from what I've heard was that actually that wasn't the response. That it actually felt that it had something to do with things that lie outside the editorial, that lie outside the propagandistic, and that's just the way it felt to me. So I'm not really making a case for the fact that it elevated my work in any way.
I think you took a risk with that,
Yeah.
Peter, and you went way out on a limb. Just I totally agree with John, and I think it did work, and I think you pulled it off, and you made something really interesting and insightful and moving. But
It sounds like
as
John
a
is
curator,
saying
you had
that,
to go
like,
there too.
authorship is important, I guess. Which
Yeah, I
is it,
stand by
which
that.
well, it's so funny because there's lots. Most of the time, it's kind of bad, I guess, or some people don't like when, or often we get accused of imagining that we're artists when our authorship becomes, I guess, too evident or too visible in the organization of a show. But I think it's interesting that in a lot of the images that we're looking at, particularly certain kinds of photojournalistic images now, authorship is actually totally secondary. Like in fact yesterday,
Right.
like looking at the Gaddafi pictures, in most cases they were just attributed to AFP or something like this. The actual person who took it on their phone or something is irrelevant, and we don't seem to care. Yet at the same time, there also is, to a certain degree, is Susan Macella's here?
She's right behind me.
No, I'm not going to quote our conversation, but I do think that, there are people like Susan and others in this room who we as a culture continue to look to for their authorship of photojournalistic images in a way that's important and essential to us. At the same time we don't seem to care about who took that video.
I don't
of
totally
the woman
agree.
in Iran you don't totally agree.
No, because I think like that photo that of the Gaddafi. Roxana is dying to say something, but that photo of the Gaddafi was by a New York Times reporter, and he wasn't just saying, "I'm here, this happened, hey, street craziness." He was showing the whole complex of events and the interactions and what was going on, and I think that was in fact a sophisticated photo. In a certain
Yes, but
sense.
most of the ones, like the Gaddafi sort of bloody head up against this guy's pant leg or something, most of the ones that are actually coming via social media are not attributed to the picture takers.
Of course not.
And that's interesting to me. Somehow.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Occupy Wall Street movement right now is that unlike in Libya, where Gaddafi loyalists can go, smashing people and shooting people in the streets, we don't believe in that in America, and I don't think that the police could stomp down on the Occupy Wall Street movement in the same way with everyone with a cell phone in their pocket and the social media. There's some kind of immediacy to our communication that I think would really actually sort of have a prophylactic effect against violence in Zuccotti Park or in American protest movement. Look at Kent State. That can't happen again in that way.
Conversely, the police all have cameras now. I mean, I've seen those marches, and they all have a holster with a little digital camera, and they even have a contingent which has a name that are there simply to record whatever happens.
Right.
So
Even as they target the
it's
photographic
liability
equipment
now.
of protesters.
It's everybody's covering their ass.
But I would say it seems like, Sarah, your next point was what it means to be an artist.
No, I don't. That wasn't
Okay, that
my
wasn't
point.
your point. My point is that I think that most of the photographers I know, by the time they get serious, have made their peace with both the ubiquity of the medium. I mean, anybody born after 1926, I think, has made their peace with the fact that photography is something that exists in many forms and has many faces and can be used with a variety of ideology. I think also most of the photographers I know have made their peace with truth and fiction. I think that you could even argue that a lot of the I mean, things like ethics and journalistic standards, I think, say a lot about the culture. But I think that the journalists and the artists have something in common in terms of the urgency and the commitment and a kind of sense of a life's work being unfolded. And I do think that the artist and the journalist at the highest level represent a kind of individual response to situations far larger than their living room or their neighborhood. That there is a kind of model there of a response to an anxiety, which is the one thing that is increasing in terms of how can one possibly process, feel responsible, feel fluent in the complexities of the images that we're subjected to. Many of the ones that, Sarah, that you showed just seem to drive that point home, that we somehow feel that we should know everything by looking at these pictures. More people will probably see Schindler's List than Shoah. And I guarantee you that the people that see both, more people will cry at Schindler's List than watching Shoah. Now, what that means in the end, I'm not sure exactly.
Don't you remember after 9/11 how we described to people who weren't in New York City, we described the event like saying it was just mind-boggling. It was amazing. It was exactly like a movie. And the representation, the drama of representation becomes the reference point for reality. Reality is more unreal than the movie. So, I happened to look for the first time ever, over the last few days. I don't remember why. I guess I was thinking about this panel. I looked at YouTube video that was of this taken by this lady as she was looking out her window as the plane hit, and she goes, "Oh my God, something just hit the tower." Oh, and she sits there for an hour and a half. I mean, I only listened to about 20 minutes of it to realize what was going on, but she's sort of witnessing the whole event and filming it as she's witnessing it. I hope there are no people in their offices yet. Oh, I hope nobody's hurt. I hope nobody's jumping, and it's very, very, very eerie. I don't know why I'm talking about that, because I guess we're just talking about 9/11
But, well, I guess to return to the question that I first posed, I'm interested if people in the room here have specific thoughts about how photography may have changed in response to 9/11.
In the editors previously in newspapers, when they would get a photograph which was too gruesome, they would not put it out on wire. They wouldn't print it, and they would cuddle the public into a smoother image and then cover it in print. So you would have never seen Gaddafi's head being bashed about.
Although, did you notice that, I'd never seen this until yesterday, in the Times slideshow, there was actually a blank slide right before the Gaddafi picture
so
that
some
warned
people
us.
Still practice that.
Well, that's new.
Okay. No, it's not new. They have actually, because of the immediacy of people with digital cameras or being able to post things on YouTube, Nada's death, anything else like that, over the past 10 years, there's been a lot more imagery available to people as to what's happening around the world. Your question about the photograph, which is meant to be southern Lebanon, was it Israeli or was it Hezbollah? It's most probably a combination of the two, and it's how it's covered in the news. Because otherwise there wouldn't have been.
Of course, yes,
some
totally.
kind
I
of situation.
totally agree with you.
So it's only the information which is given out there, and people are expecting more visual information now, the immediacy of news.
When I was in college, I took a course with Fred Friendly, who was head of CBS News at Columbia, and he had quit CBS News because they wouldn't run a video that had come in from Vietnam of American soldiers setting fire to Vietnamese villages. And he said, this is true, this is happening, and we have to inform the public that we are doing this, that the Americans are in fact doing this. And CBS News wouldn't run it, not out of maybe out for that reason, but also because, we're trying to we're editing what we see, and that's always the case. We're always seeing an edited perspective on the world. I mean, that's that piece of mine, the Moro one that shows you the photo of Moro on the front page of the newspaper. That photograph is an act, a political act. It was taken by the Red Brigades in order to have power over the government of Italy. And they kidnapped him, and they fooled around with his mind.
Peter?
No, mind fucked. I mean, they said one day they'd killed him, and all the newspapers are looking for where his body is. The next day they said, we're just kidding. Here's a photo to prove it, and they gave it to the La Repubblica and Il Messaggero, and it circulated all over the world. And in every single city that it was in all over the world, the photograph is changed by its juxtaposition with other images and its size and placement and cropping and so on.
They took Trotsky out of every, lineup of the Politburo or something. When was that? 1936 or something? I mean,
Technically it was harder.
I would say actually nothing's changed after World War. After 9/11. I mean, nobody still believes half of what they see. The government doesn't respond. Victims are. The political situation has precipitated into extremes, and. I don't know. I mean, if change is associated with progress, it's been negative, but it certainly hasn't gone forward.
How has it gone backwards?
How's it gone backwards?
Yeah.
I think now the public doesn't even believe what they see. It used to be that was the problem, a postmodern, graduate thesis. Now it's, it's a sort of pervasive belief. I mean, anybody listening to Rush Limbaugh, depending on who you talk to, they believe him.
Yeah, you should just decide whether you're going to listen to Fox News or MSNBC.
I'd like maybe to answer your question with a question. We've kind of established that photographs, or rather images, influence history and the other way around at different speeds and towards different ideologies and this and that. But what struck me about your show, generally your discourse, is that, and what they said about being hesitant of participating in the show and then being happy that they had been in it and so on, the two artists were here, is that this show is predicated on a refusal of direct representation. That is at the core of the success of the show. I am going to talk about it without directly representing it. So the question is, why is it that we here, the selected few that the Museum of Modern Art locks up in the founder's room to discuss this, universally agree that the ideological starting point to discuss this intelligently and to digest this intelligently begins with a refusal to represent?
Well, I don't know that it's. I don't know that we agree that that's a necessary condition or more sophisticated position for discussing this subject. It just felt to me in trying to put a show together that, one, there wasn't that much work that had been made about 9/11 that I thought was interesting to begin with. Secondly, I thought it would be...
John's work was important. If you're making this kind of...
You don't got to answer that question.
Right. And
as an artist.
And yeah. And well, at the same time, I guess I also felt like images of the show, images of the event, writ broadly, would be redundant in a show like this because we know them in some broad way. They're almost kind of like a ready-made that you carry with you into the show. And I think that I also had the benefit of knowing that the show was going to open, having decided to open the show on the 10th anniversary, I had a pretty good guess of what the kinds of other exhibitions would be around that time. And so I knew that would be well represented elsewhere, I guess, and it's well represented online. It's not hard to access it, and so I guess it felt to me that the thing itself, particularly given the 10th anniversary as the context for the opening of the exhibition, would be hyper-present elsewhere. And I was interested in using that hyper-presence as a material within the exhibition. I mean, I hope that by the time the show closes, and certainly already it feels to me like this, I hope it'll feel incredibly dated and kind of stupid as an exhibition, like, and incredibly artificial and contrived in a negative way. But I think at the time, it was always impressive to me, or the experience was impressive, how John Elderfield's, I thought, really great Manet show in 2006 happened to be up when Saddam Hussein was hanged, and there was suddenly this coincidence of an exhibition and current events in a way, and I thought, well, how great if you could actually plan that, but you can't plan it unless you have a crystal ball, or if you actually can find something where the context is known in advance and would be and would be available to most of your audience that would see the show, then you could actually do that. And the 10th anniversary of 9/11 seemed like one occasion where that would be the case. So it wasn't that I think we can't look at representation and talk about it critically in a literal and direct way. I think we can. But I think we've also been dulled by a great degree of the volume and ubiquity of those, and familiarity at this point of the images, that there's something almost addicting about them that I think has played into, to a certain degree, the very, very limited way that we've been able to talk about 9/11 over the course of these 10 years. So yeah, I don't know that it's superior, but those were the reasons I ended up choosing how I chose.
Although, Peter, I wonder how many people going into your show assume that most of the work is made, in fact, after September 11th.
Well, most people thought they were going to see a show of art about 9/11, and a lot of people thought they were going to see photographs of 9/11.
But I'm more interested in maybe moving to the question, John, that you kind of raised about not just photography after 9/11, but really the role of the artist. And in fact, I remember, PL, your Heads show opened 2 days before September 11th, or 2 days after, I don't recall, something like that. And how that body of work, in a certain sense, came to represent that moment, at least for me it did, in many ways, because it was about New York, it was in New York. But I'm sort of curious to kind of put that question back out there to the audience as a whole, and even to John, because I think it's something you've thought about as well.
Yeah, I mean, immediately after the event, there was this huge, everyone will remember, at least especially in New York, this big kind of in-print series of, a lot of hand-wringing about wither art and what art is good for and how do we respond and do we respond and, there's these kind of deep root questions being asked that quickly stopped being asked, but the way I continue to feel about it is that there are these monolithic forms out there, like media and Hollywood and all these things. And my fantasy about the artist's role is that you see the strengths and the weaknesses and of being an individual, in response to a larger landscape. And that's what authorship is for me, and that's what great expressive acts are constituted of. Specifically to photography, there's a great tradition, and PL's Heads are certainly part of that, which is making work in public space. I think in terms of how politics or events can change photography, I can easily imagine a totalitarian version of this country in which you are not allowed to photograph in public space, and that all of a sudden everyone from Robert Frank to Gary Winogrand would look to us as a distant echo of what freedom looked like, what a democratic society looked like, to have that kind of freedom to walk the streets and comment on what you see. There are many places where you cannot do that, and I would point out that it should not be undervalued the fact that the recent lawsuit against PL was held up in court. If that one went down, Well, I really hope people appreciate just how important that decision was, because had that gone the other way, I think a cornerstone of the culture would have crumbled. And of course, there would have been a lot more lawsuits. Everyone that had a relative that was in a Walker Evans photograph could sue these. I mean, it would just be endless. I don't think, and also I think it was revealed just how fragile this situation is, the militarization of public space. This is definitely an issue that affects artists.
Well, what's interesting also, I mean, we were talking about this before, is how much photography has become public in the last decade. And I guess in that sense, all the missing flyers that were posted around the city, that these were in some sense, I mean, it's kind of crass to call them exhibitions, but there was some way in which these were printouts of photographs of people taken from, wherever, wallets or mantelpieces or whatever that people had close at hand to represent their loved ones who were missing, that then became these vernacular street shrines, whatever, exhibitions, what have you. Suddenly, photography was being used in a very particular way, in a public way, that then, I mean, also it's sort of like, the Here Is New York show. Remarkably, in retrospect, I mean, it's important, I think, to remember that this was pre-camera. The camera phone doesn't come out for another year, in a way, and you have what is essentially a crowdsourced exhibition that follows the kind of dynamics of social networking as we've come to know it, in the visual culture that has proliferated, particularly photographically, in and around those structures before the fact, almost in a way that now just seems normal to us. But there's something, I guess I wonder how much that greater sort of purchase on the public domain, in a certain sense, that photography's had in the last decade has changed it, but maybe not. Maybe not significantly.
I think. Well,
Right.
I think that there are a lot of things that have gone on in photography since 9/11, and many of them are the same things that were going on before 9/11. Certainly in Here Is New York, we used photography as a tool. It wasn't an art show, and it was a photography show, but really it wasn't a photography show. It was a nascent social networking exhibition, and I think that social networking is an important thing here. I think that photography, one thing that has changed after 9/11 is that photography has become an app. As well as you have photographers who are working in the way that photographers always worked. You have journalists who are working in the way that journalists always worked. You have artists who are working the way that artists always worked. But then you have this app, which is called photography, which is really a part of social networking. And then it's used for all kinds of other things. But I think that the impetus is different, or it's more widespread, and everyone is taking pictures because everyone has a camera in their pockets. And then the conversation between all of these pictures creates a different kind of picture than a picture that PL might take or Susan might take or something else. And that really is social networking is a thing which I think has changed. I don't think it's changed photography, but I think that photography has acquired an additional dimension.
I'd like to go back to the question about art that Eva just brought up and try to make a connection there, because I think that that it's unimportant to draw a distinction between professional photographer and amateur photographer. My son is an artist, and he has a blog, and his photos are gorgeous, but he just takes them with his cell phone every day as he's going around town. And I think that as an artist, as I said before, part of how I understand my job description is to try to break down some of those monolithic, conventional ways we have of seeing things, and to kind of open them up and get into more of a open space of thinking about things. And I think that that's what art does. It sort of it lifts us out of conventional thought and experience. And great photographs do that, great paintings do that. It doesn't really matter. I think that's what art does, and I think that the ability to see things visual and to organize them and to unorganize them and construct them and deconstruct them, that's what artists do. But I also think it's what curators can and really might be doing. I think your show does that, even though...
Are you going to say should be doing?
Yeah, I almost did, but I stopped myself.
Why?
Because I think... There's a lot of curators. No, that's not why. It's because I think so often curating ends up being gather the collection of the biggest names around with the biggest, we'll get one of those and one of those and one of those and one of those. And I just think that it can be a creative thing and might be. And as I said in the last panel, Eva, you remember that I said that, what was the name of that guy, the show that oh God, what's his name? The one that connected all the objects.
Vic Muniz.
Yeah, the Vic Muniz show was one of my favorite shows ever here, and it was just beautiful, drawn from the collection, this thing next to that thing next to that thing, and each thing kept kind of looping around and changing how you thought about the thing next to it. And it was like a Lewis Carroll poem or something. And I think that an artist can be a guest curator and can do that and have their name, even though I can't remember his name, big over the door. But a curator, sometimes I try to figure out who curated this show, whose mind is at work here, and you kind of like read the small print and you go online and you can't even figure it out. And I think that curators can and might take a more creative role in seeing the world of art and wearing the artist's hat themselves.
I have a question. Does anyone remember one truly great photograph that resulted from 9/11?
Yes. There's a photograph taken by a 13-year-old girl with a cardboard camera out of the window of a 727 in 1997, and it's the two towers rising through the mist.
Well, wait a minute. That's I mean, as a result, as actually qualifying as the show you didn't do.
Yeah, The Falling Man. The Falling Man's the easiest one for me.
The employee, the woman, the worker, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm asking.
I think
something a great photograph because it is like such a great photograph, or is it a great photograph because it fulfills a particular function at a particular time? And I don't know. I'd sort of like to get back to the question of how did 9/11 change photography? I mean, it just seems like I don't know. The 19th century was about the engineering of the division of labor. It seems that the 20th century has been this into the 21st, this accelerating of division of experience, and somehow photography seems kind of linked to experience, and has both has had this kind of paradigmatic relationship to something that we have a photograph in our wallet of a friend or a child or a parent, and then we see a photograph which is a portrait in a museum. I mean, they're in a way they're pretty much the same thing, but the whole experience and what we use them to do is quite different. So something can be, if I have friends who take pictures of their children on Facebook, and they're great photographs. They're often, and you can really feel that, but it doesn't necessarily, and wouldn't translate into a museum or a gallery. But it does seem, and I sort of wonder, is this, it doesn't seem that it's the technical advancement of photography alone, nor does it seem to be what's going on in the world. I just sort of wonder if there's any sort of single thing that kind of changes everything, or does it have to be part of a whole different kind of matrix of things? I don't know, one other thing my assistant was in today, who does all my, helps with Photoshop work, and he was telling me, he said, do you hear there's some new software out there that people are using in the Middle East to take pictures of demonstrations, and the press is using this software, and it kind of changes the location of the place, changes spaces so that you can see what is there, but you can't identify too much so that people can be arrested, which I thought was like, okay. Oh, that's somehow like reverse of the Trotsky erasure, and is somehow a democratization of the airbrush, which was at one point just the province of people in power.
I'd like to make a point. Since the question earlier on, I'm trying to follow this, is, I need a mic? I'm usually pretty loud. I have two? A stereo? You got that? The question early on was how photography was changed since 9/11. And all we have to do is look at that exact day. What happened? Well, the so-called crime scene was immediately cordoned off. FEMA was there within hours. They were right uptown and they ran down. Within days, Joel Meyerowitz, I wish he was here today, went to, I think it was the Museum of the City of New York, and got credentialed and decided he was going to photograph at the actual site. But that wasn't all he wanted to do. He wanted to put together an FSA, since Evans was mentioned, like team to get a bunch of photographers. He was going to open it up to everyone, and were you invited in that? I was invited, and then that was immediately locked down. So what we know is how photography changed, and this refers to something PL was saying, is since 9/11, that event, press people couldn't get in, your press pass did nothing for you. Photography was excluded. Since then, we are being constantly surveilled. These are statistics anyone could look up online. There are more cameras up and down the street. We don't need the cops to have cameras. I witnessed an accident with my buddy here a few years ago. The cops immediately had 3 cameras on Broadway that saw everything. We're constantly being photographed. As far as being safe with software, there are drones. Now, I'm not making this up. Not making it up. There are drones flying around these demonstrations with facial recognition software. This has been announced. So they can identify people with, while they're doing it. They don't need to go online and see your pictures of the demonstrations. We might think that we're getting closer to democracy with all the social media, etc., when in fact, the internet can be turned off whenever that's convenient. It's been centralized. Not only are the news media, all these many outlets been condensed in the last 10 years more than ever in an accelerated way. So it's really two faces of the same coin very often, Fox News and MSNBC. Give me a break. The same corporate sponsors for all of them. The independent access to all of this photography, it only exists at the whim of the people in power. So photography is, what serious artists are going to be doing with it. Sarah, what you're doing, PL, what you're doing, and everyone else in the room. We'll keep doing it. We're going to do what we do. But let's face it, the way photography is being dispensed, the way it's being absorbed, is probably more controlled than it's ever been. We don't even have to go to World War II. We can go back to the Crimean War and the Civil War to see how all of these things have always been doctored and changed, et cetera. I mean, this is just the way it is. And the militarization of the streets, congratulations, I know I already did the last time I saw you. That's great with the lawsuit, but there are cops with machine guns everywhere questioning everyone, me, my students, everyone with a camera, as if a camera is some kind of weapon.
I think
It is.
The cell phone is a cell phone because they don't stop you with a cell phone for some reason. I mean, I don't know why, but you can point a cell phone in any cop's face, a stealth phone, and they won't do anything. They might even, ask for a copy. But if you put a real camera in their face, forget it.
Well, maybe that answers the question about reality. The idea that we're constantly surveyed. In regards to the software, there's a new software that the British developed that tracks in crowds certain types of movement. So you don't need a demonstration. If there is a shot of Grand Central, it identifies people moving in a particular way and say, oh, these guys may be dangerous. So it's all about software design. But then there is a reality, and that is that surveillance has become a totality. The only totality we can...
Try to find a cop in London.
But the whole controlling of documents and controlling of public space, I mean, we've got Haussmann's Paris. Why did we get Haussmann's Paris? Because of mid-century revolution.
But now we're also part of that at the same time, right? That's kind of the point of what you're talking about, is that there is a way in which we also instantly are photographing everything as presently and as ubiquitously as the state is. I mean, what's interesting is cameras have been getting smaller, right, in the last few years. So there actually are still, for a little bit longer, surveillance cameras that we can see, right? The little black whatever. But those are going to go away soon, and then they're just going to be there taking pictures. We're not necessarily going to see them or talk about them in the same way.
But it seems like there's also sort of like a big part of this conversation that's missing, in the sense that, and it's like kind of maybe like the arrogance of a room full of photographers, the way that events are happening has changed radically, where I would argue that 9/11 is an event that was staged for other people's cameras, and that's really the radical thing. It's like,
exactly.
There was planes following in Hiroshima when we dropped the atomic bomb, but it wasn't until 9/11 you've got things staged for everyone else's camera.
Yeah.
And that's really the thing
On
that's
that
radically
scale.
different, where we see like these images of, from Iranian protests and even Gaddafi, it's not done until we see pictures of the body dragged through the street. And that's sort of, in my mind, really the kind of crisis at hand, is that the way that things are unfolding in public is for everyone to document rather than who documents or what the documentation is.
So what's radical then is to withhold the image of bin Laden. So we don't have it.
It's also interesting to think about the difference between the video and stills. I think there is a difference. Certainly when they come out of cell phones, I think video is now at the point where photography was 150 years ago. People say, well, cell phone video is reality. This is a real thing. Of course it is or it isn't. And if you looked at the Occupy Wall Street video of the cop spraying 2 weeks ago, there was, from one perspective, it looked one way, from another perspective, it looked another way. But the cell phone video was really taken to be reality in the way that photography was really in its infancy. And I don't know about what cell phone pictures are taken to be, but I don't think that they're viewed in quite the same way.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about, is that the cell phone is like what Walker Evans did by making a camera that looked one way and took a picture in the other way. The cell phone is like the first thing, is like a stealth camera that's ever been invented that anybody can use. Because if you're standing on the street trying to take a street photograph, you can look like you're not taking a picture. And that gives you the sort of the illusion of authenticity, that when you hold a camera up to your eye and take a picture of somebody in the street, they're going to possibly notice what you're doing.
It also works in museums too. Yeah.
See what I mean?
I'd like to go back to the question of how 9/11 changed photography. And I think one thing that's important to just insert into the conversation was that it happened in the U.S. and that we were brought into the world. And that was huge. And I think when you look at everything that happened, in terms of, this was the first thing that happened on our soil.
And that's what brings us into the world?
And what brought us into the world was, why would people do, so many people were shocked that this could happen here. NPR started, putting on the BBC. All of a sudden people started thinking about why does the world hate? I mean, I'm not me. I was not surprised that but many people are asking, why does the world hate us? If you looked at the national conversation, all of a sudden everyone here in New York was documenting a huge catastrophe on our soil. We were used to looking at pictures other places. And I think it's so changed the situation here in the U.S. and that's, the U.S. media does have a lot of power, but we're all here in New York witnessing that. I know I'm not alone in people that all of a sudden went, should I photograph? Is it right to photograph? And then all of a sudden everyone was photographing. So I just want to throw that in, of just like the politics of it happening at a time when our whole relationship to photography was changing because of the internet and digital technology, so that now when an event happens in the world, where do we all go to look to see? I don't think I'm alone. I look at the New York Times, but then I go to the papers of the country where it's happening. I do Google searches. I want to find all these multiple sources, and I think 9/11 made that shift, but it brought us into that because it was here.
I think 9/11 was important because it was the most spectacularly, cinematic, fantastic event. It was a horror, but nobody's done it better. And, it will remain.
But who did it? Who did it? In that way. 9/11 was the terrorism was visual as much as it was killing people. This was
That's what I'm saying.
Yes,
it's like spectacular. Jerry Bruckheimer, just wept when he saw that.
But it was an explicit hijacking of photography and of our visual culture and turning it back on ourselves.
Then
as surely as it was a hijacking of airplanes.
I have a question. How many of you saw images of Bhopal in India when the American company blew up?
Of what?
The one is lying around.
Yeah.
So the question here is, how big is the voice of America that it can televise this all around the world? But yet something that happens in India that kills so many people, how many of you saw these images?
Yeah.
I also wanted to flip it around in another way related to what we're talking about. About a month after 9/11, I was in Paris, and I was just, since I live in the West Village, and was walking down the street when the planes hit, and of course I had to, my students and I were out on the street. I had to lock them in a classroom because I have photography students who would have run down there and gotten themselves killed. And then we watched the buildings fall. And so again, and I live in a neighborhood where it smelled for a month, where everyone, including myself, gave blood, where people were, rifling through socks and standing in, St. Vincent's. In other words, to me, this was an experience that continued over a long period of time that was very personal and very specific on a physical level. So about a month later, I go to Paris, and I got into many arguments, which was quite interesting on exactly the levels we're talking, because a lot of the people I talked to, because they were sitting at a cafe when it happened, or their mother called them and they watched it on TV, from the point of view of the people I was speaking with, everyone owned that event. That there was really no difference between the experience of people who were standing on the street, or Joel Meyerowitz, or this one or that one, and everyone else who watched this event. So again, from the flip perspective, it seems to me that it has not only changed photography, but it has completely changed our definitions of our relationship to events and physical experience and to witnessing. Yeah.
Do you think the picturing of it was central to that ownership element?
It was the ubiquity of the picturing, and it was the spontaneity and the live from and all of that. And so really, it was very difficult to express to people that there were many different sides to that event that were 24/7 and that were very much related to your physical body.
But see, I wonder, I wasn't alive when Kennedy was killed, but I guess the interesting thing, of course, is the shift. When people say, well, where were you when you heard that Kennedy had been killed? And of course, where were you when you saw the Trade Towers collapse? There's a difference. Mm-hmm. The difference in verb attests to the different media landscape within which both of those disasters occurred. But there is no complete document of the Kennedy assassination. The Pruder film comes closest. It wasn't even shown on television for more than a decade after it happened. The images, the photographic images that we saw, were stills from that film, in a certain way, kind of like the YouTube clips, oddly enough. That was a moving image that was stopped and shown to us in Life magazine. But there, the absence, in a certain way, of witnessing in a comparable way doesn't seem to have made that any less personal.
Oh, I think so.
Except, let me just say, as a 10-year-old then, I watched TV, I could not be pulled away from the TV. It was like live TV for 3 days. So we did have something similar. It wasn't as much from different points of view, but that's all you could watch on TV.
But do you know anybody who thought that they were there in Texas? That's the difference.
Right.
No, but there is some analogy to watching the World Series of that's what people feel like watching it on TV is actually better than watching it in the stadium.
I do.
And watching 9/11 on TV, you get the same visceral kick. Sorry about the word, but
Yeah.
as somebody who's invested in the Giants winning the Super Bowl, they get to see the game better than somebody sitting in the yard.
Well, the interesting thing, I mean, I was in New York at the time. I wasn't down there, but I thought I'd kind of seen everything, probably like we all have. And when I started working on the show, one thing I was interested in is where the images of all the exploded bodies of the jumpers were, because we'd never really seen them. And so I thought that they were, suppressed somewhere, and that someone had a stack of these somewhere, and we just hadn't seen them. I now believe they don't really exist, and weren't ever really taken in the volume that I imagined that they were. But nevertheless, one day it occurred to me to sort of look for them online, but particularly, maybe to your point, Michael, I guess I was looking for videos rather than still images, and that was where I found them. And there are videos of people's bodies hitting the ground. And it took 10 years for me to even think to look for that.
I want to mention something about this sort of need, which sometimes it feels it does come from the West, this need for the spectacularization of the image. And that's something that happened actually in Romania. And these things happened in 1989, but the Romanian television, the Romanian Revolution was the first sort of fully televised revolution.
Great Faroki piece, right?
It's a great Faroki piece in the media galleries now. And that happened because, in fact, the so-called revolutionary forces took over the TV station. So they took over the TV station, so everything was happening. The revolution was happening from that station. Now, what is less known, however, is that when Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were actually executed, they were executed without a real trial. It happened very fast, and they were executed. And they were executed so fast that there was no documentation of the execution. So in order to sort of have that proof of the event, once they had been executed, they were propped back again for the video shoot. And so they were executed all over again for the video camera. But what I want to go back with 9/11 is this sort of 9/11 paradox of the images, what happens with the images. And I was reading over the weekend a book that a colleague of mine, Clément Cheroux, who is a curator at the Pompidou, he wrote, and I have the book here, which is quite exceptional book. It's unfortunately not translated, it's just in French, but where he's actually has done a research on all the images. So there is this huge discrepancy between the thousands and thousands of images that have been taken by everybody around since, the hitting of the towers took like 2 hours before the towers even collapsed. So there were thousands of photographs that were taken at that time, and including pictures of people falling, some crashing to the ground. And then the extremely few images that were shown on the covers of American newspapers, and which subsequently were disseminated also to the international press. So there is sort of like this extraordinary repetition, of the same image. This is a classic one of the towers in flame, and obviously one tower in flame is just another image of a tower in flame, but repeated like thousands and thousands of times everywhere, it becomes an icon. So the sort of iconicity of the image, which brings me to back to what you were showing before. So he sort of arrived at the conclusion that there were just a very few types of images. All in all, in the aftermath, there were images and about 5 types of images that were being shown on the newspapers. One being, this image of disaster, but very soon replaced thereafter with images of heroism. And one of the images of heroism was, in fact, the Joe Franklin analogy, because there were the 3 firemen who put exactly the Franklin image that put the flag in the rubble. And as he was taking that image, he was obviously thinking of the Iwo Jima picture with the 5 Marines planting the flag. And the same is true of the Pearl Harbor, and all the flames coming out at the time of the attack. So it's this sort of what brings me a little bit to your show, and this notion of, he's talking about inter-iconicity of images, which is in a way what in, literary criticism is called intertextuality, and how, in fact, a certain type of images are being read through previous images, and that kind of relationship. So it's the creation of that déjà vu kind of, situation. Yeah.
I wanted to, we're talking about events that are seen by a number of different people from a number of different perspectives, and whether they become icons or whether they're staged to become iconic and as symbolic acts, which I believe, certainly 9/11 is, and many, many political interventions of that sort. But I just wanted to go back in time a tiny little bit and think about 2 other images. One is, in 1969, I was in Morocco when the US NASA mission landed on the moon, and there was one camera there, and that one camera took one video of one step for mankind, and one step for whatever, and a giant step for mankind. And being in Morocco, it was very strange, because my Moroccan friends there thought it was just a complete staged U.S. heroic propaganda movie. They didn't think it had anything to do with the moon in the sky. They just thought it was just a big, soundstage production. And that was very confusing to me. I was surprised by that. I don't have a point to make out of that. I just wanted to go back to the idea that there are events that have only had one perspective, and traditionally that's been the role of the photographer. And if you think about the very first photograph to show a human being is that photograph of the boulevard in Paris, where the guy's got his foot up on the shoe stand and he's posed. Who's that by? Nadir? Nadir. And he's got having his shoes posed, polished, so he's stable for long enough to appear in an image. And before that, there were never even any people in any photos. They were just boulevards.
It wasn't invented yet. That was 1838. It wasn't formally invented.
It wasn't 1938. It was 1826, around
the
about.
shoe shine, it's 1838.
Oh, no, you're right.
But I think that goes back to what Roxanne
That's what
was
they pay
saying
me
about,
for.
taking the picture of the execution of Ceausescu, because that was something that was needed. So, I mean, I think there's sort of, it's a funny relationship between photography, which documents something, and a photograph which is needed for a moment and then gets found or gets made.
But that was part of what was, in some ways, extra brilliant about the 9/11 attacks, is that you had 2 things there that were identical. So you could hit it once, and you didn't need to prop it back up and hit it again, because you could hit the thing beside it that looks exactly like it, and therefore, and completely change how we looked at the first one, right? It wasn't an issue of repeating something that we already know has happened. It was the second one then makes clear what the first one was. So it was, can I have your attention, please?
That's right.
And then this other thing. And I think that the profound violence of that retrospective effect, I think, has a lot to do with these kinds of other ways that we're looking elsewhere for things, because that deja vu experience in reverse, in a certain way, was part of the very unique trauma of what 9/11 was.
By the way, this book is called Diplopli, which
Right.
translates as double vision, really. But the final point that I wanted to make with what has changed, and that's not necessarily what has changed since September 11, but certainly it has changed since then, maybe going back further in time, is this what you were mentioning about this relational network that photography is part of, So on one hand, you have Flickr and Twitter and Facebook, where photography becomes a network, where images are being networked, basically. And on the other hand, you have that iconic image, which it is decided upon that will be disseminated and that will remain the one that sort of, when you think back over and over again, you think of that image. And that's interesting because that has to do with a different type of network that has to do with a multimedia corporation, global network of who owns the images and who disseminates those images, which there are very few.
But part of your point, though, is that there's also a historical desire or a historical determinism to the kinds of images that get chosen in that way, because of our need to see certain kinds of actions, forms, or iconographies repeated.
Yeah.
Well, in 2001, I happened to be a 20-year-old working at AFP, the wire agency, and the thing I remember back then is the only way images were quickly disseminated were through those three big picture agencies, AFP, Reuters, and AP. And AP is just a conglomerate of every single newspaper in North America. And AFP has an interesting situation where they're in every single French Foreign Legion in the world, and that's how they're large and largely disseminated. And I wasn't there that week, but I remember when gruesome images would come over the wire, they would get distributed through DC. And say it was a gruesome plane crash in India or Pakistan. There was a tag that we put on it called mandatory kill, like that it could not be distributed in North America. So we definitely censor stuff like that. And when pictures came in over the wire of September 11th, images were killed. There's a hole punched in them, speaking of FSA. And if those images weren't archived right then, they sort of just went into the ether. There are photographers I know that were there. There's Aristotle Economopoulos. I don't know if anyone knows him, but he worked for the Star Ledger, and he does work for Star Ledger, and he was injured. And I know for a fact that he sort of had that attitude that certain gruesome things shouldn't be distributed in North America, and that was the sort of mentality he had then. And I know that he edited his own gruesome pictures, like they're gone, and he won't share it with the world. But it's tough now, a decade later, to think about how controlled those three news agencies were, and how much control they had over the dissemination of visual images, and how those images were the first images that were mechanically reproduced and seen in the second and third world newspapers. Definitely back then, 95% of the world wasn't looking at the internet or YouTube or Flickr. And those are the archivist, the news editor had a lot of power back then.
Well, I would just ask, how has photography changed since 9/11? I might turn that around and say, how has life changed since 9/11 in response to photography and the possibilities of photography? 9/11 was an event that was designed, an act of terrorism that was explicitly designed to be photographed. And the photographing of that event heightened the terrorism, increased the power of the event, and really served the purposes of the people who promulgated the event. I think that the the growth of digital photography, the use of cell phone cameras, the networking, all these things we've talked about, I think has arguably, I don't know, but one could ask, has it changed the nature of events? Certain events are being constructed in a way so that they can be photographed in a certain way, so that that will then be promulgated in a certain way and increase the message. And I think that that's a reasonable question, and it's something that underlies a lot of the comments that we've heard here today.
That's what I wanted to point out, is that one legacy that I keep hearing, I don't think anyone's acknowledged, is the immediacy of the transparency of failure to create icons that maybe just that 9/11 was so visceral that shock and awe is just, it's nothing. It's the moon landing, right, for the people in Morocco. The toppling of the statue in Baghdad, it's a failure as an attempt at creating an iconic image. And you kind of go through history in the last 10 years, and there is this, I mean, it's not an accident that most films about 9/11 have utterly failed to connect with audiences because there's no fix. There's no, you can't replicate that, that thing that you felt.
I would say that's because the callus that grew over people's sensibility was exacerbated greatly by I don't remember daily reports of people blowing themselves up and killing 25 people around them. And, I think the kind of war that resulted from that was immensely different. I mean, I'm sure that the war in Iraq, most of the casualties come from suicide bombs and, devices, whatever they call those, planted. The American casualties, yes. Well, we don't hear about the other ones. They're just they're just a number on Judson Church. But if I would say that if there was a sort of filtering out of extremely violent events, now I think that there's a lot of stuff that is not seen but is described. So when you actually see it, it's not shocking. It really isn't. And I remember one of the things that was really contradictory about 9/11, and that was, why in the world would 19 people want to spend 2 years in America preparing to kill themselves in such a weird way, And it now, in hindsight, would seem impossible. Get on a plane with some box cutters, pay cash, but it happens all the time.
I'm curious why no one has brought up Abu Ghraib, because I actually think that maybe that at this point had a larger impact on photography or changing photography in our, and in particular, Americans photographing. I'm not talking about the art community. I'm not talking about professional photographers, but that instinct to document and to create evidence that existed on September 11th. Perhaps the troops have some sort of similar impulse. I'm wondering if that desire to document and create evidence in an event like September 11th is similar or not to what the troops, what the soldiers were doing when they interrogated and then, committed horrible atrocities and then documented it and documented themselves with the prisoners. So, and I'm curious especially to hear John speak about this, just because of the nature of some of his work.
I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, you're grateful the pictures exist because it helped crack open a situation that needed to be cracked open. At the same time, I got to say, the one thing I can contribute, and I don't know if it's related necessarily to your question, is that whatever big leaps forward in the ubiquity of photography, the transmittability of it, all of the things that we've been discussed, from my point of view, photography as an ambitious act, the artist's relationship to photography has always been a fragile proposition. We've always had to contend with the glut of imagery, from news to fashion to whatever. I mean, this is the world we live in. I think photography is something that the world is subjected to, that we all have to wrap our heads around. But for the artist, who wants to say something both it's just a complicated thing. But at the same time, it's incredibly contentious. So the fact that anybody ever thought that a photograph was true is a great boon to the artist photographer. The only photographer I know who uses the word truth in discussing their work is Nan Goldin. She says, this is the truth. This is what happened.
I looked up on the internet just because I was curious. I looked up real photography.
Yeah.
And there are 25,000 websites of people claiming to be real photographers taking real images.
Right, yeah.
And you remember
apparently
about the
digital
return of the
photography
reel that
is
happened like whatever it was 10 or 15 years ago after constructed images, manipulated images, and all that postmodern stuff. The real came back, and the real really has been threatened by postmodernism in a very
That's not really related, though, to Abu Ghraib, is it? I mean, that idea of the real in photography, and did that happen? Does that I mean, I'm curious. It's more rhetorical. Does that matter?
Well, look, I mean, on the one hand, you have to read those pictures as a kind of expressive act, right? They were performing. Right. They were inventing this stuff. Yeah, I mean, this was as much folk art as it was. Evidence. I remember a pre-digital case where a young couple went on a murderous rampage and killed the guy's boss, and then cut up the body and photographed it in the hotel room, and then brought the film to Photomat, and that's how they got caught.
Office kill.
There's the lineage of those Abu Ghraib pictures. Is the lynching photographs of the early 20th century. They were made by the thousands. They were made into postcards. They were sent around. They were sold and sent around, as they were handed out like party favors. That's where it comes directly from that. Not from anything else. Yeah, all of that posing next to the
Yeah, they asked that woman in the trial. They said, "Why are you?" She was standing on top of a pile of naked prisoners, and they said, "Why are you smiling?" And she said, "Because that's what you do in a photograph."
Cheese.
There was even a show of these recently in New York at Andrew Roth's gallery.
There's a book.
And there's a book.
There is something that's quite different about the lynching photographs and the Abu Ghraib photographs, in that this was not supposed to be widely disseminated. It was not supposed to be published.
They knew they were doing something bad.
I think it was.
So maybe that's what's changed.
When the lynching picture was happening, people thought that was right.
Yeah, but the black people were considered subhuman. Like women used to be two-thirds. They used to be two-thirds of a person, right? Was that the?
Well, I mean, it's if you, I think I have this one now. But it's just to get back to Abu Ghraib. Those were trophy photographs, and I. Just quickly, in 1969, a man who turned out to be my future brother-in-law, Buddy, came back from Vietnam and gave me some negatives that had U.S. Army negative sleeve. And he asked me to make prints for him. I just had a little home darkroom. I was just starting. And I looked at them and I couldn't print them. And the story was that he bought a camera when he was on R&R in Tokyo. And he was in a chopper. He was a rear gunner. Those guys died pretty quickly. And he just machine gunned a couple of peasants. They landed the chopper. He photographed them. He gave the prints away and asked me to make more. The postscript to the story, and it's an awful story. I never made them, and I told him I lost the negatives when I moved. He got in touch with me about 6 or 7 years ago. And he said, look, the government archive burned down in Texas, and now they're saying I don't have post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know you didn't lose those negatives. I know why you didn't give me those prints. I know what you really think. Could you give them back to me? And I had my graduate students make prints, and I wrote a letter on Columbia University stationery, and I told them I had these negatives all these years, and that's how this guy ended up getting benefits. They were trophy photographs. These are just people walking down the road. I mean, it's not special for Abu Ghraib. This is what happens when you send young men to kill strangers, the other. Like, it's related to the lynching photographs.
Sex and death have been linked since, Eros and Thanatos. Aren't they relatives?
And there's no question that there's a sexual aspect to Abu Ghraib, and I think that there was no slim connection between the fetishization of what happened in 9/11 and the people who were both the victims and the heroes, and some sort of, I think, perverse sexual, I don't know what they were doing, frankly. It's too weird for me to be able to analyze, but I am sure that there is a Freudian link somewhere, and that people do get a kick out of violence, for sure. We all know that. And extreme violence is a kind of secret pleasure that's so foul that people can't even admit it to themselves, but they act on it anyway. That's my instant analysis.
Hi, I have a question for Peter. I'm just wondering, like, if there's a reason why you didn't include or maybe choose not to work with like all Middle Eastern artists or artists who particularly work with like, you know, politics of the Middle East, like the Atlas Group and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess because I couldn't find a way to do it. I couldn't find a way to include Middle Eastern artists without instrumentalizing them in a way that I wasn't comfortable with. I mean, I guess that's the short answer.
I was wondering, like, if you saw it as a, you know, particularly like as an American experience, and you didn't want to include like the global.
No, I mean, I couldn't. I don't know. I mean, I couldn't. I had a lot of space, but I didn't have an enormous amount of space, and I couldn't make the show about everything to everyone, and so, and it's not. I mean, I wasn't trying to make an authoritative show in any way. So at a certain point, I put some limits on it for myself, and actually, still, I'm not settled for myself. I mean, I don't feel good about not having, I guess with the exception of Sia Armajani, who's lived in this country for 50 years, not having the Middle East present in the show in the form of artists from there. But I couldn't, and I obsessed over this for months, trying to figure out a way to.
But it's a local perspective. It's, you know, we don't have to globalism everything.
No, I'm not interested in making excuses for it. I mean, I don't. It's something that I wish I'd been able to figure out for myself differently in the making of the show.
But and might be something for the 25th anniversary.
yeah, no.
Because at this point, history is more distant.
I guess it's more just that I was hypersensitive to it. I mean, there's tons of work that one could have put in that show, of all sorts of, you know, time periods and nationalities. But I guess because the question of misuse was so central for me in the making of the show, my own issue of use of artists' work, and then also the central way in which the question of misuse relates to our entire cultural processing of 9/11.
It's appropriation that you're talking about.
Right. You said, I mean, your work is, Sarah, you said your series, you know, when we first talked about it, and even tonight, you said, well, but it wasn't about, I was interested in, what did you say? I don't even remember what you said. I'm interested in a philosophical question. I'm not interested in questions of appropriation and all these other kinds of things. But I
That
guess,
word didn't interest me at all.
But for me, the reason your work,
But I was afraid of your sensationalizing.
Yeah.
And that image, which I did not approach as, I wasn't trying to sensationalize. I was trying to talk about sensationalism in a culture of sensation. And, how do we relate to...
But which is a question of use. And that's why that body of work was so essential to have in the show for me, is because it has at its heart, irrespective of its appearance in a show like this question about the use of the appropriation of someone's death in the service of something outside of itself, right? That is something that's inherent, although not often remarked upon, in the journalistic image, that then you make more apparent by rephotographing. And that here, I wanted to make even more apparent by doubling that relief back on itself by misusing your misuse of this misuse.
We even
in the
had a whole
context of an
discussion
exhibition.
about the height we were going to hang the pieces at, because you suggested you would hang it high, and I thought that was just too illustrative and too exploitative, and I just didn't want to go there. And I said, yeah, but no, that's not how they were, that's not how I meant them, and that just sensationalizes it. Then we ended up, just by sheer coincidence, we were doing some press interviews, and we were waiting for somebody or other to come, and they didn't come, and we were just hanging around the gallery, and Peter said, let's hang your piece. So we brought it out, and we kind of had guys lifting it up and lifting it down, and we sort of went an inch higher, an inch lower, and I was letting him lift it a little higher than I was comfortable with, because I did want to kind of trigger that whatever it is, she's falling thing, but I didn't want to, sensationalize it. So we went a little higher, a little lower, and finally we said, right there. And the spot where we put it was, whatever it was, 43 inches off the ceiling and 43 inches off the floor. And it was just sort of, that looks right there, just sort of a hint of something weird.
Peter, would you do anything else now that the show opened that you haven't done with it? Anything at all? Or did you want?
Do I wish things were different about it?
Is there anything, or is there anything that you wanted to do and you didn't end up doing with the show? Or now that it's up there? I always want to redo every show that I do all over again in a different way, so that's why.
I don't know. No, I'm really happy that it's. I mean, I wish it was already down, to be honest. I mean, it's. No, I mean, I guess I wanted it to be over even before it was up. I guess it made. At one point early on, it seemed like a good idea, somehow, or not a good idea, but it seemed like. It seemed like an important idea, I guess, and maybe I fell into that trap somehow, and I guess spending that much time with that material was deeply unpleasant in the way that it should be, I guess. But it was like the opposite somehow of organizing other shows, where normally. I don't know, normally I'm trying to figure out my own relation to the subject somehow so that it can be like personal enough that then it becomes bigger again. But in this case, it was almost like a question of having to remove myself in order to give a form of representation to something that was deeply personally traumatic for a lot of people. And at the same time, represent the kinds of cultural and political violence that have happened in the event itself and in its wake, and that was one of the strangest things I've had to, I guess, try to figure out how to find a form for. So no, I mean, I'm happy enough with what's there, and at a certain point, I couldn't take it anymore. And it is what it is.
Charles Straub feels the same way. Charles and Michael did Here's New York, and I'm sorry. Yes, of course. And he said to me the other day, I'm sorry, I apologize. Charles said to me the other day, I'm so sick of 9/11. I wish they'd just shut up about it. Enough already. And, you know, I sort of feel the same way, kind of. You know, it's like, okay, we've had the 10th anniversary. Your show's great, but sometime it'll be over. And
I guess what's creepy to me, the one thing that I wish was different, isn't so much something about the show. It's just that I guess I was trying really hard not to make a clever show about 9/11. And I was hoping that people would get more pissed off, I guess. Or not pissed off, but at least that it would do something different. I mean, for Christ's sake, I put a Hollywood movie soundtrack in the show over top of some of the work that's over a ground-up airplane engine. There's a Hollywood movie soundtrack playing that, like, I think all that did was annoy some people in a certain way. Or some people liked it, right? Or something. I mean, I'd like it, I guess, too, but I want some of the things that I did in the show, I hoped would invite, like, I'm sad that there was no New York Post article about Sarah's photograph or something like this in advance, because all of those articles, all of those attacks from I don't know, I don't want to say the right, but all of those sorts of attacks, in a certain way, they attack people who aren't interested in fighting that fight. And I was actually interested to fight that fight, and I think someone has to fight that fight in this country, because here we have, just weeks before this show opened, Steve Reich's album cover comes out of his World Trade Center piece, and he chooses an image of the second plane about to arrive and sort of distresses it a little bit, and people go nuts about this, and he says, look, I'm interested in the music. I don't care. We'll just change this because I don't want to get sucked into this. But I actually wanted to get sucked into it, and I didn't get sucked into it, and that makes me sad. Yeah, there were a group of 9/11 widows who came on at the opening because they, I guess, wanted to do that instead of going to Ground Zero. But I haven't heard responses from them, except I heard that they liked it through someone who knew one of them or something like this. But you know, I guess and maybe it's at that point people were just sick and tired of 9/11.
Well, I actually think,
to a certain degree.
I'll say this carefully. I think that the observance of the 10th anniversary was a kind of predetermined event.
Sure.
Things were going to be talked about, other things were not going to be talked about, or if they were going to be talked about, nobody was going to pay any attention to them because they were ancillary to the things that everyone was thinking about. I think that now that the 10th anniversary is over, it becomes possible and imperative to think about and talk about other things, but I don't think on that occasion that there was bandwidth for that to happen. You know, and if you think back to Eric Fischel's statue, if you think back to things, you know, years and years ago that caused enormous outrage, it's because the response wasn't predetermined at that point. But the anniversary response was predetermined. It was given that it was going to be about the victims, rightly, and about the state of the nation in this fairly unquestioning way. That, you know, and then. Now that it's over, I think that we can begin to think about the things. And I venture to say that if your show opened today, that it probably would get that, it might well get that kind of attention, but that because it opened on 9/11 itself, or whenever it opened on 9/10, it was sort of, it just was drowned out by all of this other stuff.
I'm going to have to, on these curatorial confessional notes, to end this evening discussion and to thank very much Peter and Sarah and John and everyone in the room for participating.